The gym buzzed with the usual clanging of weights and the rhythmic thump of fists hitting pads. But today, something felt different. There was an electric tension in the air. It wasn't the usual post-workout exhaustion that hung over the room, it was the anticipation of something far more intense, something that was about to spark. "Hey, you there!" The voice was sharp, cutting through the noise like a knife. Everyone turned. Mason Harris, the gym's black belt instructor, stood in the center of the mat. His muscles were chiseled, his posture perfect, as he pointed toward the janitor on the other side of the room, Tariq Johnson. The man's mop was paused mid-swipe, eyes meeting Mason's for a brief second before returning to his work. Tariq was used to being invisible, an unseen presence in the gym, just another cog in the machine. "Yeah, you," Mason sneered, his grin spreading. "How about showing us a little demonstration of your skills? You ever even been in a real fight?" The gym fell silent. Some of the students shifted uncomfortably, others stifled nervous laughter. But it was clear, Mason wasn't joking. Tariq didn't flinch. He just kept his gaze fixed on the floor, scrubbing the stubborn stain that had caught his attention. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost like he hadn't heard Mason's taunt. It was a tactic, though, he wasn't about to give in to provocation. "I'm just here to clean," Tariq said, his voice steady, calm, but there was a fire behind it that no one could see. "I'll finish up and you can get back to your training." Mason laughed, loud and obnoxious. "A janitor wants to talk about training? Look at him, guys, afraid to step on the mat. You all know why I'm here, right? Time to show these kids what real skill looks like." The gym filled with uneasy chuckles, but there was an edge to them now. Mason wasn't just mocking Tariq anymore, he was testing him, pushing boundaries. The students were watching closely, sensing the shift, wondering how the janitor would respond. Tariq kept wiping, ignoring the growing attention. His silence was deafening. But there was more to him than anyone knew. No one, not even Mason, knew that Tariq was more than just the man who cleaned the gym after hours. Tariq had lived a life in the ring, before the accident, before the loss. He had been someone, a fighter to be reckoned with. He had been, Tariq the Silent Storm, 5-time MMA champion. But that was a lifetime ago. "What's the matter?" Mason asked, stepping closer, his voice now dripping with sarcasm. "Scared? Come on, show me what you've got. How about just a simple guard? I bet you don't even know how to do that." The gym seemed to hold its breath. Tariq's hand paused over the mop handle, and for the briefest moment, his eyes met Mason's. The briefest flicker of recognition passed between them. For a second, it wasn't the black belt instructor and the janitor, it was two men, two fighters, who knew what it meant to stand in the ring. "I'll show you," Tariq said finally, his voice low but controlled. "But when I'm done, you'll apologize to everyone here for turning this place into a circus." Mason scoffed. "Apologize? Me? You're gonna be the one begging for mercy when I'm done with you." Tariq set the mop aside. There was no anger in his eyes, no rage. Just the calm before a storm. Everyone watched, waiting for what would come next. This was no longer a challenge, it was about to become a lesson. Tariq stepped onto the mat slowly, each movement deliberate. The gym's lights glinted off his worn, faded shoes, nothing about his appearance gave away his past. To anyone else, he was just the janitor. But to Mason, a man who had built his reputation on intimidation, this was about to become a reality check. The students shifted uneasily as they formed a semicircle around the mat. Mason cracked his knuckles, adjusting his belt, preparing himself for what he thought would be an easy win. "Everyone gather round," Mason said theatrically, still enjoying the attention. "Watch closely, you're about to see why there's a hierarchy in this gym. Let me show you why someone like him doesn't belong in here." Tariq's eyes scanned the room. There were no words, no grand gestures. Just a quiet stillness that seemed to cut through the tension. And then, something in him shifted. The quiet confidence that had always kept him out of the spotlight began to surface. His shoulders straightened, his stance widening, just slightly, enough to signal that the fight was about to begin. "Last chance, man," Mason taunted. "Either you step up and fight, or I'll have security throw you out. And while we're at it, I'll make sure you lose your job too." Tarek's lips curled into a slow, almost imperceptible smile. "You want me to fight?" he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "All right. But just remember, you asked for this." And with that, the room grew still. The gym was tense. The air felt heavier now, like everyone knew something was about to happen but no one could quite say when. Tarek stood on the mat, his feet firmly planted on the floor, his posture calm but focused. Across from him, Mason paced in small circles, sizing up his opponent with that ever-present smirk on his face. "So, you're actually going to do this, huh?" Mason's voice broke the silence, still dripping with disbelief. He glanced around at the gathered students, his grin widening as he saw their eager faces, expecting a spectacle. "I hope you've been watching closely, because you're about to learn why people like you never belong here. Not in this gym. Not in my world." Tarek said nothing. He didn't need to. His eyes, calm and unflinching, told the story far better than words ever could. He wasn't here to prove anything to Mason, he was here to remind himself of who he was and who he'd been. The clock was ticking, and the moment of reckoning was at hand. As Mason continued to taunt him, something shifted within the crowd. Whispers started. They weren't about what Mason was saying anymore, they were about Tarek. About who he really was. "I heard he used to be an MMA champion, the Silent Storm, right?" A voice from the back of the gym, low and uncertain, but loud enough for others to hear. "Yeah, but he quit after his friend died in the ring. Wasn't that like 5 years ago?" Someone else murmured. "That's gotta mess you up." The gym went quiet, a ripple of understanding flowing through the students. They were beginning to see Tarek differently, but it wasn't enough. Mason could feel it too. He wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. The crowd wasn't as eager to cheer him on anymore. Tarek's silence, his calm, was working against Mason. It was unsettling. The real fight had already started. "All right, enough talk," Mason snapped, his voice suddenly colder, more aggressive. "Let's see what you're made of." Without warning, he launched forward, throwing a quick jab aimed directly at Tarek's face. It was fast, too fast for most, but not for someone who had lived and breathed in the ring. Tarek didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched. The punch missed. It wasn't just that it missed, it was the way Mason's punch seemed to lose all its power the moment it reached Tarek's face. The room went silent. Every student, every onlooker, was suddenly aware that something wasn't right. That wasn't just a simple punch that missed. There was something effortless about it. Mason stumbled forward, trying to regain his balance, but Tarek was already moving. With a subtle shift of his body, Tarek slid to the side, just enough to let Mason's next move, another jab, fall harmlessly short. And in that same fluid motion, Tarek's hand shot out, not to attack, but to guide Mason's momentum off balance, sending him stumbling to the ground. "What the hell?" Mason grunted, scrambling to his feet, but there was panic in his voice now, a slight tremor that hadn't been there before. Tarek's expression didn't change. He was still calm, still in control. "I'm just showing you the difference between strength and strategy," he said softly, his voice carrying across the gym. The students exchanged glances. They had seen Mason train, he was fast, powerful. No one could move like that without real skill. And yet, Mason was losing his footing, both literally and figuratively. Tarek wasn't just stronger or faster, he was something else entirely. Something that came from a different kind of experience. Mason wiped his mouth, his arrogance beginning to slip away. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my students," he spat, wiping his hand across his face as if trying to erase the sting of humiliation. Tariq didn't respond. He didn't need to. His body, his stance, his silence were saying everything. The more Mason moved, the more it became clear, this wasn't a fight for pride. This was Tariq's way of showing the students, the people watching, that true strength wasn't about size or loudness. It was about control. And that wasn't something Mason had. "You're just a janitor, Tariq," Mason hissed, frustration creeping into his voice. "You don't belong here." Tariq looked at him, a flicker of something in his eyes. "Maybe not. But that doesn't mean I don't know what respect looks like." Mason lunged again, this time with more fury, his punches faster, wilder, as if to make up for the first round of missed blows. Tariq dodged again, effortlessly, his body moving with a rhythm that was almost graceful. And just as Mason's final punch came toward him, Tariq stepped in, not to block or avoid, but to redirect. With a single movement, he twisted Mason's arm behind his back, his body pressing against Mason's as he forced him down to the mat. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Tariq whispered as Mason struggled beneath him. The gym was still. No one had ever seen Mason Harris, legendary instructor, feared black belt, brought down so effortlessly. The students were frozen, unable to look away. Tariq wasn't just beating him physically, he was doing it with an ease that suggested years of experience, years of fighting on a level that Mason could never understand. The gym had never been quieter. Everyone stood in a kind of suspended disbelief, eyes fixed on Tariq, who was still standing at the center of the mat. Mason was sprawled on the floor, panting, his face flushed with a mix of rage and embarrassment. The once confident instructor was now staring up at the ceiling, trying to catch his breath as his pride lay in tatters around him. Tariq took a slow step back, his posture relaxed. He didn't say anything, there was no need to. The fight, in a way, was already over. Not because Mason had been physically defeated, but because the moment Mason lost control, he had lost the battle for respect. The room, once filled with the sounds of punches and laughter, was now silent. Only the distant hum of the gym's air conditioning cut through the thick tension in the air. "I didn't want to fight," Tariq said, his voice calm, like he was explaining something simple. He looked down at Mason, who had just started to rise, his pride clearly more wounded than his body. "But you gave me no choice." Mason's eyes narrowed. He was struggling to regain some sense of authority, but the damage had been done. "You think you've proven something? Huh? You embarrassed me, in front of my students." His voice was a mixture of anger and disbelief. He was still trying to hold on to whatever dominance he had, but it was slipping away. Tariq simply shook his head. "I didn't want to do this in front of anyone. But sometimes, things need to be shown. It's about respect. Not power." Mason shot to his feet, a bit more recklessly this time. "Respect?" He scoffed, brushing dirt off his GI. "I'm the one who's supposed to be teaching respect here, not some janitor." His words were strained, but they still held a venomous edge. It was clear he wasn't ready to accept what had just happened. He wasn't ready to admit that Tariq had taught him the most important lesson of all, that respect is earned, not demanded. "No," Tariq responded, his tone unwavering. "Respect isn't given based on a title. It's earned by how you treat others, by what you've been through, and how you handle your mistakes." Mason clenched his fists. His jaw tightened, but something in his eyes flickered, doubt, frustration, and maybe something else. "So you think this makes you better than me?" He took a step forward, daring Tariq to speak again. Tariq met him with the same stillness, but his eyes were different now. Not cold, but full of something more, wisdom, understanding, and most importantly, restraint. "No, Mason. It makes me a person who knows that sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is walk away from a fight." The silence that followed was thick. The students were still standing in their spots, unsure of what they had just witnessed. No one moved, no one spoke. The atmosphere had shifted, and the tension had transformed into something deeper, respect, not just for Tarek, but for the way he carried himself. Emma stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Mason, you're not just a black belt because of your fighting skills. It's about the way you carry yourself, your attitude, your leadership. That's what this gym respects." Mason turned to her, his face red with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "You're talking about respect like it's something I haven't earned." He glanced back at Tarek, then turned his eyes away quickly. "You think I'm just going to stand here and let a janitor teach me about respect?" But Emma stood her ground. "It's not about what you think, Mason. It's about what you show the people around you. If you lead with arrogance, you lose everyone's respect. And that's what happened here." Tarek didn't need to say anything. Emma's words carried the weight of truth. Mason paused, his head dropping slightly. For the first time, he seemed to consider something deeper than just his pride. It was a crack in his armor. But he wasn't ready to let it show yet. The gym had quieted down, but the unspoken words still hung in the air. Mason stood to the side, his arms crossed tightly, eyes focused on the floor as if he was trying to avoid everyone's gaze. It wasn't just about his pride anymore. It was about his identity as a leader, something that was slowly slipping through his fingers. The students were still in a daze, exchanging glances but unsure whether to approach. The fight, if it could even be called that, had shifted something fundamental in their understanding of what it meant to train, to fight, and to lead. Tarek, however, was already walking to the back of the room, grabbing his mop without a second glance at Mason. His movements were as graceful as ever, as if the drama from earlier hadn't even happened. To him, it was simple. Lead with respect, and everything else would follow. "It's not about being the strongest person in the room," he had once told a friend. "It's about knowing when to stand tall, and when to step back and let others learn." Emma watched him for a moment before turning back to Mason. "You can't let this slide, Mason," she said quietly. "You have to own this." Mason didn't respond. He just stared ahead, a knot of frustration growing inside him. "I didn't want this. I didn't ask for this. But it's happening anyway." Later that evening, as the gym emptied out, the lights dimmed, and the sound of cleaning supplies echoed in the quiet, Mason stood alone at the center of the mat. He was no longer the confident instructor he once was. The last few hours had unraveled something inside him, something that had been building for years but had never been fully addressed. As he stared at the spot where Tarek had stood just moments earlier, a thought crossed his mind. Maybe it's time to change. The gym was still, but Mason was no longer looking for the same approval he once craved from his students. He had just learned a lesson the hard way: the only thing that truly matters in this world is the way you treat others, and the way you lead them. But it wasn't too late. He could still fix it. The gym felt different the next morning. It was still the same place, filled with the familiar sound of weights clanging and the occasional grunt from someone pushing themselves too hard. But the energy had shifted. There was a new kind of focus in the air, a subtle change that had taken root after the events of yesterday. Tarek's presence, his silence, his restraint, had left a lasting impression. Mason arrived early, his footsteps slower than usual. He was still processing the events of yesterday, still wrestling with the realization that he wasn't the leader he thought he was. He stood by the mat, looking at the empty space where the confrontation had taken place. "You good?" Emma's voice broke the silence, pulling Mason from his thoughts. He turned to face her, and for the first time, his eyes weren't filled with arrogance or anger. There was something else: vulnerability. "I don't know if I'll ever be good again," he admitted, his voice rough. "I thought I had it all figured out. I thought I was doing right by my students. But..." His words trailed off. Emma smiled softly, a gesture of understanding. "We all make mistakes, Mason. It's what you do after that counts." Mason nodded, letting out a deep breath. He'd spent years building an image of himself as the perfect instructor, someone who knew it all. But what he had learned yesterday, in front of his students, was that real leadership wasn't about being the strongest or the loudest, it was about owning your flaws and learning from them. Mason stood up a little straighter. Yeah. I've got a lot to fix, but I'll start here. The gym was buzzing with activity by the time the first class began. There was a quiet anticipation in the air, a sense that something had changed. Mason was walking around, engaging with students more than he ever had before. There was no boasting, no grand speeches. Just genuine conversations and encouragement. Remember, it's not just about the technique, it's about the discipline behind it, Mason said to a group of beginners. Fighting is about control, not power. His words were more grounded now, more thoughtful. It was clear that he was starting to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. Tariq, meanwhile, was at the back, quietly sweeping the floor, keeping to his routine. He wasn't there to lead the class, that was Mason's job. But he was always present, a steady presence that reminded everyone of the strength in humility. Mason paused in his teaching for a moment, watching Tariq work. The respect he felt for the man was undeniable. And while he wasn't about to ask Tariq to teach just yet, there was a new appreciation in his eyes. You know, Mason said aloud, more to himself than anyone else, you were right. Emma, who had overheard him, walked up and raised an eyebrow. About what? Respect, Mason said simply. I've spent so much time trying to prove myself, I forgot what really matters. It's not about me. It's about them. He nodded toward the students, who were listening intently now. It's about them learning, growing, and respecting each other. That's what I should have been teaching all along. The weeks following the confrontation were a mix of progress and setbacks. Mason was still learning, still adjusting, but the changes in him were evident. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And in a way, that was enough. Tariq, ever the quiet observer, continued with his work, but there was a subtle shift in the way the other students interacted with him. They began to seek him out, asking for advice, not about technique, but about life, about how to stay grounded and focused. Tariq didn't offer grand wisdom or long speeches. He simply shared his experiences, his lessons learned the hard way. One evening after class, as the gym began to empty, Mason walked over to Tariq. Hey, Tariq, he said, the weight of his past actions still lingering in his voice. I want to thank you. I've been thinking about what you said, about respect. And it's been a wake-up call for me. Tariq glanced up, giving him a small, quiet smile. No need to thank me. You got there yourself. You just needed a push. Still, Mason said, rubbing the back of his neck. I think you deserve more than that mop. Tariq chuckled softly. It's just a job, Mason. But I appreciate the thought. He paused for a moment, then added, I'm not looking to teach. I don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Mason understood. He'd been there. The need for approval, the constant proving of one's worth, it was exhausting. But what Tariq had shown him, more than anything, was the power of being content with yourself. Maybe one day you'll change your mind, Mason said, smiling. But for now, just keep being you. That's enough for all of us. Mason had never been this open before, not with his students, not with anyone. But as the months passed, the gym began to change. There was a new energy in the air, one that wasn't driven by the need to prove strength or dominance. It was driven by a sense of purpose and respect. One evening, during a particularly intense class, Mason was demonstrating a new technique. As he moved through the motions, he caught Tariq's eye. The brief exchange was simple, a shared understanding that things were different now. After the class, Mason pulled Tariq aside. I've been thinking, he said. Maybe you were right all along. About leadership, I mean. I've spent too much time trying to get people to respect me. But you, he paused, trying to find the right words. You didn't need to try. You just showed up. And that's why people respect you. Tariq raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the change in Mason's tone. What are you trying to say? Mason smiled slightly, a flicker of humor in his eyes. I'm saying you've got a lot more to teach us than just technique. And maybe, just maybe, you could teach the class, too. Tariq hesitated for a moment. Then, in his quiet way, he nodded. I'll think about it. But no promises. And for the first time, Mason didn't need a promise. He just needed to know that Tariq had finally found his place, not as a janitor, but as someone with the power to change lives, without ever needing to say a word. The gym was buzzing with energy. The atmosphere had shifted, but it wasn't just the students who had noticed it. Even the walls seemed to hold a different kind of strength, an energy that was infectious. The once overbearing tension had been replaced with a sense of community. The students, some of whom had been hesitant to approach Mason or Tariq before, were now engaged in conversations, exchanging thoughts, and seeking advice. The gym had transformed into a place where learning went beyond just the physical. Students were starting to learn about leadership, respect, and discipline in ways they hadn't considered before. It was Thursday evening, and the advanced class was in session. Mason had just finished explaining the technique of the day, a complicated series of movements that combined both strength and strategy. As usual, the students were focused, but there was something different today. Mason had allowed Tariq to help with the demonstration, a sign of trust that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. All right, Tariq, show them how it's done, Mason said, his voice steady, no longer laced with arrogance. His words were simple, but the respect in them was clear. Tariq stepped onto the mat, his movements fluid and calm. He didn't have the flashy, dramatic style of some instructors, but what he did had a quiet precision to it. Each motion was deliberate, controlled, and well executed. The students watched in awe, trying to keep up, but it was clear that Tariq wasn't showing off. He was simply demonstrating what was necessary. As he completed the demonstration, he stepped back and gave the floor back to Mason. There was no need for applause. No need for words. The students understood the lesson already. They understood the power of being calm under pressure, the power of control. For the first time, they realized that fighting wasn't just about who could land the hardest punch, it was about who could maintain composure when it mattered most. Mason smiled, a true smile this time, not the smug grin he used to wear, but one that conveyed pride. All right, let's break it down. Tariq showed you exactly what you need to do. Now it's your turn. The class flowed naturally from that point forward, students engaged in learning not just technique, but philosophy. They weren't just following moves anymore. They were starting to understand what it meant to respect the art and, more importantly, each other. After the class ended, Mason and Tariq sat at the edge of the mat, watching the students practice. There was a new energy in the room, an openness. Students were collaborating, helping each other correct mistakes, offering encouragement instead of judgment. It was a drastic change from the competitive, sometimes toxic atmosphere the gym had once had. Emma walked over, catching Mason's eye. I've been watching. There's a difference now. People are talking, sharing their thoughts. They're not afraid to fail. Mason nodded, his eyes still on the students. Yeah, I can see that. It's like they're finally seeing what this is really about. They're starting to understand that strength doesn't mean being the best at everything. It means being the best version of yourself. Tariq, who had been silent as always, finally spoke up. They'll get it. They just need time. They'll learn that this place isn't about defeating each other, it's about growth. As long as they keep pushing forward, they'll get there. Mason looked at Tariq, a silent acknowledgement of how much he had learned over the past few weeks. I don't think I could have done this without you. Not just the teaching, but the perspective you brought. You were right. Leadership isn't about dominance. It's about serving those you lead. Tariq's expression softened. Leadership is never about the person in charge. It's about the people you're guiding. The ones who look to you for support. You get that now. Mason smiled, but there was something more reflective in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. The gym had settled into its new rhythm. People were learning, growing, and respecting the art in each other in ways they hadn't before. But just as things seemed to be going smoothly, an unexpected challenge presented itself. A message came in one afternoon, not from a student or a fellow instructor, but from an old acquaintance of Mason's. Someone from his past who had once been a rival, someone who prided himself on his undefeated record and who now ran one of the top gyms in the city. I heard what's going on at your gym, Mason. I thought you were a man of pride and skill, not a man who let a janitor show him up. You've lost your edge. Come test it, let's see if your new approach has worked. I'm sending my best. The challenge is on. Mason read the message once. Then twice. He stared at it for a moment, feeling a familiar rush of adrenaline. Old habits die hard. The competitive fire that had driven him in the past was still there, a deep urge to prove himself, to show that he could still be the best. But this time, he wasn't the only one affected by the challenge. The students were whispering about it, unsure of what to make of the situation. Emma walked over, her face full of concern. What are you going to do? Mason's expression was focused, but there was a subtle calmness to it now. What do you mean, what am I going to do? He half smiled. I'm not going to let some ego-driven challenge take this gym off track. It's not about proving I'm better than him. It's about showing my students that this gym is different, that we don't need to fight with pride, we fight with purpose. Tarek, who had been listening from the side, nodded slowly. That's the right choice, Mason. It's not about beating someone just for the sake of winning. It's about teaching what truly matters. The day of the challenge arrived. Mason knew he wasn't stepping into a ring with his old self anymore. This wasn't about ego, this wasn't about pride. It wasn't even about fighting to win. It was about showing his students what he had learned, what they had learned together. Mason arrived at the other gym, where his old rival was waiting, his team of fighters in tow. The gym was packed with people eager to see a match, eager to see a rivalry play out. Mason felt the weight of it, the expectations, the tension, but this time, he wasn't carrying the burden of proving himself. His opponent, a seasoned fighter named Travis, stood confidently in the center of the mat. He was known for his speed and strength, and he'd never been defeated in the ring. But as Mason stepped onto the mat, he felt a quiet confidence, a steadiness he'd never had before. You sure you're ready for this, Mason? Travis called out, his tone mocking. Mason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he met his opponent's eyes and gave a slight nod. Ready when you are. The fight was intense, each move precise, each counter deliberate. But what struck everyone watching was how calm and focused Mason remained. He wasn't rushing in. He wasn't trying to prove he was the best. He was simply fighting with a purpose, to show that the true measure of strength wasn't in who could land the hardest blow, but in who could stay grounded, stay focused, and stay true to their values. In the end, Mason didn't win by brute force. He won by outlasting Travis, by demonstrating control, by staying calm and composed under pressure. As the fight ended, Travis conceded with a nod of respect. Mason, still breathing heavily, smiled. He had nothing left to prove, except to himself. The gym was different now. It wasn't just the atmosphere that had changed, it was the people who filled it. The energy in the air was no longer filled with tension or competition. The students were focused, not on outdoing each other, but on improving themselves. They shared ideas, corrected each other's form, and respected each other's progress. It was a quiet revolution, one that was born from the lessons Mason had learned, from Tarek's guidance, and from Emma's steady influence. Mason stood at the front of the room, no longer the imposing figure he once was. Instead, he was an instructor who moved with purpose and clarity, guiding the students with respect. He no longer needed to shout or prove himself, his presence was enough. His leadership was rooted in humility and strength. Alright, everyone, today we're going to focus on precision, Mason said, his voice calm and steady. It's not about speed or power. It's about control. About knowing when to strike and when to hold back. The students nodded, listening intently, and for the first time, Mason felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He wasn't just teaching technique anymore, he was teaching them how to be better people. The students weren't just learning how to fight, they were learning how to lead with integrity, to respect each other, and to understand the real meaning of strength. After the class ended, Emma approached him. "You did good today," she said, her smile genuine. "They're not just following your moves. They're following your example." Mason paused, feeling the weight of her words. He had spent so much of his life trying to be the strongest, trying to prove his worth to everyone around him. But now, it wasn't about proving anything. It was about sharing what he had learned, about fighting for something bigger than himself. "Thanks, Emma," he said, looking around the gym at the students who were packing up their things. "I think I finally get it. It's not about being the best in the room. It's about being the best for the room." Emma nodded. "Exactly. And you're doing that, Mason. You're showing them what it means to lead." Mason smiled, a real smile this time. He wasn't perfect, but he was better than the man he used to be. And that, he realized, was enough. Just when everything seemed to be falling into place, an unexpected challenge arrived. A rival gym, one that Mason had faced off against countless times in the past, had sent an invitation for a friendly sparring session. It wasn't an official competition, but it carried the same weight. It was a test of Mason's gym's growth, a test of his new leadership. The invitation was addressed to Mason personally, but the message was clear: are you still the same fighter, or has your new philosophy made you soft? Mason sat in his office, staring at the message, the weight of it settling in. He could feel the old competitive fire stirring inside him, the part of him that wanted to accept the challenge and prove that his gym was stronger than ever. But this time, it was different. He wasn't fighting for pride. He wasn't fighting to prove anything to anyone. He was fighting to protect the principles he had built with his team. "What do you think?" Emma asked, knocking on the door. She had seen the look in his eyes and knew exactly what he was thinking. Mason looked up at her, his expression conflicted. "I don't know. Part of me wants to show them that we're stronger than ever. But, another part of me thinks we've already proven what we needed to prove." Emma stepped into the room, her tone calm but firm. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Mason. Not anymore. You've already changed. Your gym has changed. The question is, do you want to fight for the same reasons you used to? Or do you want to fight for something more?" Her words hit him harder than he expected. She was right. He didn't need this fight. He didn't need to prove anything. The lesson wasn't in winning a match, it was in how they had all changed. How they had grown together. Mason took a deep breath, standing up slowly. "You're right. It's not about fighting for the past. It's about fighting for what we've become." The day of the sparring session arrived, and Mason walked into the rival gym with a quiet resolve. The gym was packed with eager spectators, the energy crackling with anticipation. His students were with him, standing by his side, but there was no tension in the air. No one was nervous or afraid. They had learned to focus on the right things, not the outcome. As Mason entered the mat, he saw his old rival, Travis, standing across from him. Travis was everything Mason used to be: cocky, aggressive, always trying to prove he was the best. But today, Mason wasn't here to show Travis that he was stronger. He was here to show him that the real strength was in control. "So, this is how you've changed, huh?" Travis said, his eyes scanning Mason, his grin wide. "You've gone soft. I guess you're not the fighter you used to be." Mason didn't respond. He didn't need to. The match started, and Travis came at him fast, throwing quick punches and kicks, trying to overwhelm him. But Mason didn't react the way he used to. He didn't rush in or try to overpower Travis. Instead, he moved calmly, controlled, using Travis' own momentum against him. Every move was measured. Every counter was deliberate. It wasn't about winning, it was about showing that he had learned something greater than just technique. After a few minutes, Travis was visibly frustrated. He was fast, but Mason was patient. He wasn't letting Travis control the pace of the fight. Finally, Travis made a mistake, overextending himself. Mason seized the opportunity, not with a hard strike, but with a gentle push, guiding Travis to the ground. "You've still got it," Travis said, getting up slowly, his expression a mix of respect and frustration. "But you've changed." Mason smiled, not with pride, but with a quiet satisfaction. "Yeah. I have. And I'm glad I did." As the sparring session ended and the students filed out of the rival gym, Mason stood at the edge of the mat, watching the other gym's members gather their things. The competitive energy had faded, replaced by something more meaningful. Emma walked over to him, a smile on her face. "So, what now?" Mason glanced around, his gaze lingering on the students, the gym, and the life he had built. "Now, we keep moving forward. We keep teaching them what matters. It's not about the fight, it's about who we are when the fight ends." Mason had learned that the true victory wasn't in defeating others. It was in finding peace within himself. It was in knowing that no matter the outcome of any fight, on the mat or in life, he was leading with respect, integrity, and purpose. And that was enough. The days after the sparring challenge passed quietly, but there was an underlying sense of change in the air. The gym was quieter in some ways, but the energy had also shifted. People were now more focused, more driven to improve themselves. There was no longer a sense of competition or comparison. Instead, everyone was on their own journey, moving toward personal growth. Mason spent less time on the mat himself and more time helping his students, guiding them, and encouraging them to explore the deeper aspects of their training. It was no longer about mastering a technique for the sake of winning a match. It was about mastering themselves. But one lingering thought still plagued Mason's mind: was he really ready to fully embrace this new philosophy, or was there something more he still had to prove to himself? It was late one night when the test came. A knock on the door of the gym interrupted the quiet hum of cleaning equipment. Mason turned to find Travis, the old rival, standing in the doorway. His face was neutral, but there was an unmistakable tension in his posture. "You got a minute?" Travis asked, stepping in without waiting for an answer. Mason wiped his hands on a towel, his gaze steady. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Travis looked around, taking in the gym. "This place, it's different now. I can see it. I see the way people are treating each other. There's respect here, real respect. And I can't help but wonder," he paused, clearly uncomfortable with his own words. "If I missed something. If I've been doing it all wrong." Mason stood still for a moment, letting the weight of Travis's words sink in. There was no anger in Travis's voice, no resentment, only curiosity and a hint of regret. This wasn't the Travis Mason had known, the one who always thought winning was everything. "I'm not sure what you mean by that," Mason said quietly, his voice even. "But it sounds like you're looking for something. What is it you want, Travis?" Travis ran a hand through his hair, looking more vulnerable than Mason had ever seen him. "I want to know if what you're doing here, what you've done, is the real thing. I've spent years teaching people how to fight. But now, I feel like I've been missing something. Like I've been teaching them how to win, but not how to live." Mason stepped closer, nodding slowly. "It's not about winning, Travis. It's about learning who you are in the process. About respecting the art and respecting yourself. If you can do that, then winning will follow, whether it's on the mat or in life." Travis's eyes softened, and for the first time, Mason saw a glimmer of understanding in them. "You've changed, Mason. This place is different. And you're different, too. Mason smiled, a little ruefully. Yeah, I've changed. I had to. But that doesn't mean it's easy. I've learned that real strength isn't about being the best in the room. It's about making everyone else around you better. There was a moment of silence between them. Travis's eyes flickered toward the mat before he spoke again, his voice low but steady. I want to be part of that. I want to teach like you're teaching. Not just fighting, but living. Mason felt a sense of satisfaction, but also a sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about his transformation. It was about something larger, about changing the way people saw themselves, their fights, and their struggles. Then come join us, Mason said with a nod. You've got a lot to offer, Travis. But you need to be ready to lead with respect, not ego. The rest will come in time. The decision to bring Travis on board wasn't one Mason made lightly, but over time, it became clear that this was part of the natural progression of the gym's growth. As Travis began teaching alongside Mason, he followed the same principles Mason had learned: lead with humility, focus on character, and never stop learning. The students responded positively, but there was still a subtle tension at first. Many of them had known Travis as a rival, a competitor, someone who represented the old way of doing things. But slowly, they saw the change in him. They saw his vulnerability, his willingness to grow, and most importantly, his ability to teach them about respecting each other and the art. The transformation wasn't overnight, but over time, it became apparent. The gym had truly become a place for personal growth, not just physical strength. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the mat, Mason watched his students practicing in groups. The air was calm, the sound of feet shuffling on the mat and the soft thud of pads absorbing punches echoed through the gym. Mason had never felt prouder. He walked over to where Tariq was sitting by the side, watching the students. You ever thought about teaching? Mason asked, half joking, though the thought had crossed his mind several times. Tariq gave him a small smile, shaking his head. I'm not a teacher, Mason. I'm just here to help people when they need it. That's enough for me. Mason sat down beside him, watching the students for a while. Yeah, but you've taught all of us more than you'll ever know. You taught me how to lead, how to be a better person. Tariq's smile deepened, but there was a humility in it. Maybe. But you were the one who made the choice to change. I was just here to show you what it looked like. They sat in silence for a few moments, reflecting on how far they had come. What had started as a gym centered on competition and pride had transformed into a place of respect, understanding, and true growth. And Mason, now fully aware of the power of leadership through humility, knew that the real victory wasn't about who won on the mat, it was about who became stronger in the process, inside and out. Mason stood at the front of the gym one evening, looking out over the students who were finishing up their practice. The gym had changed. It had become something more than a training facility, it had become a place where people didn't just learn how to fight, but how to live. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory. What's next? Emma asked, walking up beside him. Are you ready for the next step? Mason thought for a moment. I don't know. But I know this, whatever happens, I'm not doing it alone. We've built something real here. And that's enough for me. Emma smiled, her eyes filled with pride. You've earned it. The students gathered their things, the quiet chatter filling the gym as they headed out. Mason watched them, knowing that they had all learned something far greater than technique, they had learned the true meaning of strength and respect. And as the last of the students left, Mason stood by the door, looking around at the space they had created. He knew this was only the beginning. This is just the start, he whispered to himself, the future ahead of him brighter than ever.